The first report didn't come from a witness. It came from a rancher who walked out at sunrise expecting to find his livestock scattered across the pasture like they always were, grazing slow, moving without urgency, filling the morning with small sounds that made the place feel alive. But that morning, the silence hit him before the sight did, a heavy, unnatural quiet that made him stop halfway through the gate as if something in him already knew stepping further would confirm something he wasn't ready to see. The sheep weren't grazing, they weren't moving, they weren't even grouped. They were spread across the field in uneven positions, some standing frozen like they had stopped mid-step, others collapsed in ways that didn't look natural, like whatever had happened to them hadn't allowed time for panic or escape. He moved closer, slowly, not calling out, not making noise, because something about the way they were positioned made it feel like sound didn't belong there anymore. The first body he reached was intact, no tearing, no obvious wounds, just still, eyes open, dry, too dry. He crouched beside it, his hand hovering before finally pressing against its neck, expecting warmth, expecting blood, expecting something that would explain why it wasn't moving. There was nothing, no pulse, no resistance. And when he pulled his hand back, there was no blood, not on the wool, not on the ground, not anywhere. His stomach tightened immediately, a cold realization settling in as he looked around at the rest of the field, because now that he knew what to look for, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every single one of them was the same, standing, collapsed, scattered, but untouched. No struggle, no tearing, no blood, just empty. As if something had come through the field and taken exactly what it needed without leaving anything behind. He stood up slowly, turning in a full circle, scanning the fence line, the trees beyond it, the open stretch of land that should have shown tracks, disturbance, anything that would suggest movement. There was nothing. No prints, no broken wood, no sign of entry, no sign of exit. Only the animals, drained, still, wrong. And then he saw it. Not in the field, not near the bodies, at the far edge of the fence, something caught on the wire, a piece of wood, long, smooth, worn at the edges, like it had been used, like it had been carried, like it had been part of something that didn't belong to any animal he knew. He approached it carefully, each step slower than the last, the silence pressing harder against him with every movement, until he reached the fence and stopped just short of touching it. Because the wood wasn't broken, it wasn't splintered, it wasn't debris, it was shaped, deliberate, and attached to it, faint, almost invisible, were marks, parallel, deep, like something with teeth had gripped it, not chewed, not torn, held, and released. His breath slowed, his hand hovered just inches away, because in that moment, without needing to see anything else, without needing another sign, another clue, another explanation, he understood something that would follow every report that came after this one. Whatever had done this didn't bite like an animal. It carried something, and it used it. The second incident didn't happen far from the first, but it didn't happen quietly either, because by then the ranchers in the area had already started keeping watch through the night, sitting out on their porches with rifles across their laps, lanterns burning low beside them, listening for anything that didn't belong, anything that might explain what had already taken too many animals without leaving a trace. It was just past midnight when the dogs started, not barking, not howling, but whinnying, low, strained, almost choking sounds that didn't carry far but were enough to pull a man out of his chair and onto his feet before he even knew why he was moving. He stepped off the porch slowly, the wood creaking under his boots, his eyes already fixed on the pen where the goats were kept, because even from a distance, something looked wrong. The animals weren't moving. Again, not a single one. Just standing in a tight cluster this time, packed together near the far side of the enclosure like they had tried to put distance between themselves and something they couldn't escape. He raised the lantern slightly, and that's when the dogs went silent, instantly, cut off mid-sound, like something had turned them off. His grip on the rifle tightened, his breath slowing as he took another step forward, careful now, deliberate, because the silence wasn't empty, it was watching. The light from the lantern reached the fence, and for a second, everything looked normal. The wood, the wire, the ground beneath it, until something shifted, not in the open, but behind it. A shape moved between the posts, low to the ground, but too structured to be mistaken for shadow, too controlled, too precise, and it didn't rush or retreat when the light touched it. It paused, like it had been caught mid-action. Then slowly, it rose, not fully upright, not like a man, but higher than any animal he had ever seen move on four limbs. Its front lifting just enough to change its silhouette into something unnatural, something that didn't match anything his mind could settle on. His finger tightened near the trigger, but he didn't fire because now he could see it, partially, the head, long, narrow, but wrong in the way it connected to the body, as if it had been placed there without following the rules everybody else obeyed. And from its mouth, something extended, not a tongue, not teeth, something rigid, something straight, something wood. The lantern shook slightly in his hand, the light flickering across the thing as it shifted again, and for a brief second, the entire shape came into view. Lean body, tight skin, limbs positioned too evenly, too controlled, and that wooden length protruding forward like it wasn't being held, but attached, gripped in a way that didn't belong to any jaw he understood. The goats didn't move, not one of them. And then the creature lowered its head, not toward the man, toward the animals. One quick motion, so fast it didn't register as movement, just a blur, and then a goat dropped. No sound, no struggle, just down. His finger pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the night, loud enough to echo across the fields, breaking the silence in a way that felt violent compared to everything that had come before. The lantern light jumped. The goats scattered instantly, chaos replacing stillness as they slammed against the fence, trying to get away from something they couldn't see fast enough to avoid. But the creature didn't run, didn't panic. It turned slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at him. And in that moment, he saw it clearly for the first time. Not just the body, not just the movement, but the way it held that wooden length in its mouth, perfectly aligned, perfectly controlled, like it wasn't just carrying it, it was using it. Then it moved, not away from the fence, not deeper into the pen, but sideways, along the boundary, covering distance faster than anything that size should have been able to. Its body staying low, controlled, the wood in its mouth steady, unshaking, as if it was part of its structure rather than something separate. He fired again, missed. The second shot hit the fence, splintering wood and snapping wire, the sound sharp and chaotic against the stillness that had returned almost immediately after the first. And then it was gone. No crashing through brush, no retreating sound, no fading movement, just gone. The man stood there, rifle shaking slightly now, the lantern casting uneven light across the pen as the goats continued to panic, slamming into each other, trying to escape something that had already left. He moved forward quickly this time, no hesitation, stepping into the enclosure and heading straight for the animal that had dropped. It was still warm, still fresh, but like the others, there was no blood, no tearing, no wound that matched the way it had fallen. Just a small mark, precise, deep, and perfectly placed. He looked up slowly, scanning the fence, the darkness beyond it, the space where the creature had been just seconds ago, and that's when he noticed something new. The wood, the broken section of fence where his shot had landed, had something caught on it. Another piece, long, smooth, worn, with those same parallel marks, and now there were two. And for the first time since this started, he understood something worse than the attack itself. This wasn't one encounter, this was something that had been here long enough to leave tools behind. By morning, the story had already spread beyond the two ranches, not because anyone wanted to believe it, but because the evidence refused to stay contained to one place, one incident, or one explanation. And by the time 3 more men arrived at the second property, they weren't coming to listen. They were coming to see if what they had heard could actually exist in front of them without falling apart. It didn't. If anything, it got worse. The pen was still disturbed, the fence still cracked where the shot had hit, the ground churned by panicked hooves, but none of that was what held their attention. None of that was what made them stop speaking the moment they stepped inside. It was the goat, still lying where it had dropped, still intact, still wrong. One of the men crouched first, reaching out without hesitation, turning the animal slightly to inspect it more closely, and the moment he did, his expression shifted in a way that didn't need words. "Same as before," he said quietly. The others didn't respond. They were already seeing it. No tearing, no blood, no signs of feeding the way any predator would leave behind. Just that same precise mark, deep, narrow, clean, and everything else empty, drained, like the animal had been used, not eaten. Another man moved toward the broken section of the fence where the splintered wood still hung unevenly, and that's when his attention stopped completely. "Over here," the others followed immediately, not because of his tone, but because he had stopped moving entirely. The wood caught in the wire wasn't just a piece, it wasn't random, and it wasn't alone anymore. There were 3 now, 3 separate lengths of wood, each roughly the same size, each worn down in the same way, each marked with those same parallel indentations that matched perfectly when placed side by side, like they belonged to a set. One of the men reached out and pulled one free carefully, holding it up to the light, turning it slightly, examining the marks. "They're not chew marks," he said. Another man stepped closer, taking it from him, running his fingers along the grooves, feeling the depth, the spacing, the consistency. "No," he replied slowly. "They're grip marks." The words settled heavier than it should have, because it meant intention, it meant repetition, it meant something had been holding these over and over again. A third man looked back toward the pen, toward the spot where the goat had dropped, and then back at the wood. "You think it's using these to do that?" he asked, not finishing the sentence because none of them needed him to. No one answered immediately because none of them wanted to be the first to say yes. But the pattern was there, clear, unavoidable, and it didn't stop there. They began checking the rest of the fence, slowly, systematically, and with every few steps, they found more, caught between wires, lodged against posts, half buried in the dirt just beyond the enclosure. Different lengths, different wear, but the same markings, the same shape, the same purpose. By the time they circled the entire pen, they had counted seven separate pieces, 7 tools left behind, not discarded, not broken, just abandoned, like they were no longer needed. One of the men stood up slowly, scanning the tree line beyond the fence, his eyes moving across the shadows as if expecting something to still be there, something watching, something waiting. "This isn't one animal," he said. The others turned toward him. He didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on the trees. "One doesn't leave this behind," he continued. "One doesn't come back this many times and just drop things." Another man shook his head slightly. "Or it's been here longer than we think." Silence followed that, because that possibility was worse, much worse. They gathered the pieces, all of them, laying them out side by side on the ground just outside the pen, comparing sizes, shapes, wear patterns, and for the first time they saw something else in them. Variation, not random, not chaotic, but deliberate. Some were thicker, some were sharpened slightly at one end, some were worn down more than others, like different uses, different purposes, different stages. And that's when the realization shifted from strange to organized, because whatever had been using these wasn't improvising, it was refining. And it was refining. It had been doing this long enough to learn. One of the men looked back toward the goat again, then toward the fence, then toward the scattered pieces laid out on the ground, and then he said something none of them were ready to hear. It didn't just kill them. The others looked at him, waiting. It practiced. No one spoke after that, because once that idea settled in, everything else began to line up in a way that made the situation far more dangerous than a single predator moving through the area. This wasn't random. This wasn't instinct. This was something that came back, improved, and left behind proof that it was getting better. By the third day, it stopped being a local problem, not because anyone called it in, not because authorities stepped in, but because the same thing started happening miles apart, on properties that had no connection to each other, no shared fences, no shared grazing land, no reason for the same pattern to repeat, except that it wasn't a coincidence anymore. The next ranch was 12 miles out, different terrain, different herd, different owner, same result. They found the cattle at sunrise this time, not sheep, not goats, full-grown animals that should have shown signs of struggle, damage, resistance, something that explained how anything could bring them down without tearing the entire place apart. But the field was quiet, too quiet. The animals were spread across a wider area, some near the water trough, some closer to the barn, some standing where they had likely been moments before they dropped. And just like before, there was no blood. The rancher didn't approach immediately. He stood at the edge of the field longer than he should have, scanning the ground, the fence, the tree line, trying to find anything that made sense before stepping into something that didn't. He didn't find it, so he walked in, slow, measured. The first cow he reached was already cold. The mark was there, same depth, same placement, too clean, too precise. And when he turned it slightly, nothing, no blood beneath it, no pooling, no seepage, just empty flesh where something had taken everything it needed and left the rest untouched. He stood up quickly, turning in place, checking the ground for tracks, for drag marks, for any sign that something had moved through here physically in a way he could follow. There were hoof prints, plenty of them, from panic, from movement, from the moment something had entered the field and changed everything. But there was nothing else. No additional weight in the soil, no impressions, no direction to follow, only the animals and the silence. He ran back toward the fence, not because he expected to find anything, but because he already knew what he was going to see, and it was there, caught in the lower wire this time, a piece of wood, longer than the others reported, darker, heavier, with deeper marks along one side, not just grip marks, pressure marks, like something had been forced through it repeatedly. He didn't touch it right away. He stared at it, because now it wasn't just one ranch. It wasn't just one set of tools. It wasn't just one pattern repeating. It was expanding. Another call came in before noon, then another. Different counties, same details, animals down, no blood, no tearing, single precise wound. Wood found near the fence. By the end of the day, 5 separate locations had reported the same thing. 5, spread far enough apart that no single animal could have covered the distance in one night, not without being seen, not without leaving something behind. But nothing connected the sites physically, no trail, no movement, no continuity, except the result and the tools. The men from the first 2 ranches met again that evening, this time not to confirm what they had seen, but to compare what they couldn't explain. They laid out the pieces they had collected, 7 from the second ranch, 3 from the first, and now 2 more from the third location that had sent word earlier that day. 12 pieces total, different sizes, different wear, but the same markings, the same pattern, the same purpose. One of them lined them up carefully, not randomly, by size, by shape, by the depth of the marks. And that's when something else became clear. They're not all the same age, he said. The others looked closer. He was right. Some were worn smooth, edges rounded from repeated use. Others were sharper, newer, less worn, like they hadn't been used as many times. They're being replaced, another man said quietly. No one argued, because it fit too well. If something was using them and leaving them behind, and new ones were appearing, then it wasn't just using tools. It was maintaining them, replacing them, upgrading them. The oldest man in the group didn't look at the wood. He looked out toward the darkening field where the light was starting to fade and the shapes of the trees were becoming less defined, more uncertain. This didn't start this week, he said. No one spoke because they all knew that. They just hadn't said it out loud yet. This didn't start this year, he continued. Silence again. He finally turned back toward them. And whatever it is, he paused, not for effect, but because he was choosing his words carefully. It's not moving from place to place. The others waited. He looked down at the 12 pieces laid out in front of them, then back up. It's already in all of them. No one dismissed that, because the pattern didn't show movement. It showed presence, simultaneous, spread, established, and that meant something far worse than a predator passing through. It meant this wasn't being hunted, this was being worked, and the work was still going on. By the 5th night, the fear had shifted from confusion to action, because when something keeps coming back and leaves behind the same kind of danger and damage without ever being seen clearly enough to stop, someone always decides to follow it, not because it's safe, not because it's smart, but because doing nothing starts to feel worse than stepping into the dark with the chance of not coming back. That man was Carter. He wasn't the oldest, wasn't the most experienced, but he was the only one who said it out loud without hesitation. I'm going to track it. No one tried to stop him. They only told him what they already knew. There were no tracks, no trails, nothing to follow. But Carter didn't believe that, not fully, because something that physical, something that moved through fences, dropped animals where they stood, and left behind tools, had to touch the ground, had to leave something, even if it was small, even if it was hidden. He started before sunset, not after, not in the dark, because he wanted to see the land clearly first, to map the terrain in his mind before the night changed everything, before shadows began to hide details that daylight still allowed him to catch. He moved along the outer fence lines of the first ranch, slow, careful, eyes scanning not just the ground, but the posts, the wires, the spaces between them where those pieces of wood had been found. And at first, he saw nothing, just dirt, dry patches, old hoof prints, broken grass. But then, he noticed something small. Near one of the posts, a disturbance, not a footprint, not a clear impression, but a compression in the soil that didn't match anything else around it. Too narrow, too deep for its size, like something had pressed into the ground with force, but not with a full step. He crouched immediately, brushing his fingers lightly across it, feeling the shape more than seeing it. There were more, not in a line, not in a track, but spaced, deliberately, as if whatever had moved through here didn't walk the way animals did, didn't place weight evenly, didn't move in a pattern that could be followed easily. He marked the spot, then the next, then the next. By the time the sun dropped lower, he had found enough of them to form something, not a path, but a direction, leading away from the ranch, toward the trees. No one followed him. That was part of the agreement. If he was going to do this, he was going to do it alone. He reached the tree line just as the light began to fade completely, the shadows stretching longer, the temperature dropping slightly, the air changing in a way that made every sound carry differently. The ground changed too, softer, darker, more receptive, and that's where it became clearer. The impressions appeared more frequently now, still not footprints, still not something he could match to any known animal, but enough to confirm movement, enough to confirm direction, and more importantly, enough to confirm size. Whatever had made these was larger than he expected, not massive, not towering, but longer, its weight distributed in a way that suggested length over height, a body that stretched, no one that stood tall. He moved deeper, step by step, every sense sharpened, every sound measured. Branches snapping under his boots left louder than they should have, unnatural in a space that otherwise held a strange, consistent quiet. No insects, no birds, no movement in the trees, just stillness. Then he found something else, caught between two low branches, another piece of wood. This one different, not worn smooth, not rounded, fresh, recently cut. The edges still sharp enough to catch the light, and the marks not as deep, not as defined, like it hadn't been used yet. His grip tightened slightly as he pulled it free, turning it in his hand, examining it from all angles, new, unused, prepared. He looked up slowly, scanning the trees around him, the darkness now settling fully into the spaces between them, turning distance into uncertainty, because that meant something simple, something clear, something he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just leaving tools behind, It was bringing new ones in, and then he heard it. Not movement, not footsteps, a sound, soft, close, behind him, like something had just adjusted its position without needing to move across the ground. His entire body locked instantly, his breath stopping mid-inhale, his grip tightening around the wood as every instinct told him the same thing at once. Don't turn fast. Don't react. Don't give it a reason to move. But the silence after that sound was heavier than anything he had felt before, because it wasn't empty. It was occupied. Slowly, carefully, he began to turn his head, just enough to shift his vision into the space behind him, and for a fraction of a second, he saw it. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. A shape, low, elongated, close enough that it shouldn't have been able to get there without him hearing it. And from its mouth, that same straight extension, that same unnatural alignment, that same tool. His heart slammed hard in his chest, because now there was no doubt left, no theory, no assumption, no uncertainty. It was real. It was close, and it had followed him without leaving a sound he could track. Carter didn't run, not because he wasn't afraid, but because something about the way that shape had appeared behind him, silent, precise, already positioned, told him running won't create distance the way it should, won't give him the advantage he needed, won't even guarantee he'd hear it coming the second time. So he stayed where he was, barely moving, the piece of wood still in his hand. His hand turned just enough to keep that shape in the edge of his vision, because looking at it directly felt like stepping into something irreversible, like giving it acknowledgement it didn't need but might be waiting for. The forest didn't react. No wind, no shifting leaves, no breaking branches, just that same stillness pressing in from every direction, making the space feel smaller than it actually was. Then it moved, not forward, not backward, but around him, low, controlled, circling, and this time he heard it. No footsteps, but a faint drag, soft, measured, like something smooth brushing lightly against the ground as it adjusted position without fully committing its weight. His grip tightened around the wood instinctively, because now the idea wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't something left behind. It wasn't evidence. It was present, active, and it was using it. The shape passed through a gap in the trees ahead of him, just wide enough for the last of the fading light to catch it for a split second. And that was enough. The body was longer than he expected, spine slightly arched, limbs placed with unnatural precision, not spread wide like an animal, not touched like something cautious, but positioned for control. And the head, lower than the shoulders, extended forward, with that wooden length fixed in place, aligned perfectly with the direction it was facing, not loose, not hanging, steady, as if it was part of how it functioned. Carter shifted his stance slightly, just enough to adjust his footing, and immediately the creature stopped, completely. No drag, no movement, no sound. It had registered it, matched it, reacted, and that's when he understood something critical. It wasn't just moving through the space, it was reading it, reading him, matching every adjustment, waiting for an opening that didn't come from speed, but from mistake. His breathing stayed controlled, slow, measured, even as the pressure in his chest began to build, even as his body prepared to move in ways his mind hadn't decided yet, because the distance between them was already too small. Then the sound came again, but not from where it had been, Not from the front, not from the side, from behind him. Again, closer. His entire body reacted before his thoughts could catch up, turning faster this time, breaking the stillness, breaking the rule he had set for himself. And this time, he saw it clearly. Not fully lit, not completely revealed, but enough to remove any doubt. The skin, tight, uneven, stretched over a frame that didn't follow natural proportion. The limbs, too controlled, too deliberate in their placement. And the head, tilted slightly, as if studying him the same way he had studied the ground. The wooden length in its mouth was darker than the one in his hand, worn, used. The marks along it deeper, defined, and at the end, a point, not sharp like a blade, but tapered, refined, built for something specific. Carter raised the rifle, finally, not hesitating now, not waiting. He fired. The shot tore through the silence, echoing hard through the trees, and for a moment the creature didn't move, didn't react, didn't flinch. Then it shifted, not away from him, toward him, fast, too fast, closing distance in a way that didn't match its size, didn't match the way it had been moving before, like it had switched from observation to action without needing transition. He tried to step back, his foot caught slightly in the uneven ground, just enough, just a fraction of delay, and that was all it needed. The movement that followed was almost impossible to track, not because it was invisible, but because it didn't move the way anything should. 1 second it was there, the next it was within reach, and then contact, not tearing, not biting, but impact, precise, directed. The wooden extension drove forward, not wildly, not with force meant to break, but with accuracy meant to hit exactly where it needed to. Carter's body locked instantly, his breath cutting off as the sensation hit, not pain first, not shock first, but pressure, deep and immediate, like something had reached inside him faster than his nerves could process. He tried to move, tried to react, but his muscles didn't respond the way they should. Everything slowed, his grip loosened, the rifle slipped from his hand, hitting the ground with a dull thud that sounded distant, disconnected, like it didn't belong to the same moment anymore. The creature didn't stay, didn't linger. The contact lasted only seconds. Then it pulled back, clean, controlled, stepping away the same way it had approached, precise, measured, without wasted motion. Carter dropped to one knee, then both, his hands pressed against the ground instinctively, trying to stabilize himself, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to force his body to respond the way it always had. But something was wrong, not externally, not visibly, but inside. Something had changed. The creature watched him, not rushing, not attacking again, just observing, as if waiting to see the result. Carter's vision blurred slightly, the edges darkening as his breath struggled to return to normal. Each inhale shallow, incomplete, like something essential had been interrupted. And in that moment, as his body began to fail in a way he couldn't stop, he understood what had happened to the animals. There was no tearing, no blood, no struggle, because whatever this thing did, it didn't need to. It only needed one precise moment, one perfect placement, and everything after that just stopped. Carter didn't make it back. That was the first sign something had gone wrong beyond what anyone had prepared for. Because even the men who believed they were dealing with something unnatural still expected a man with a rifle, a head start, and daylight on his side to return with something, a direction, a warning, a clear sign of where it had gone. Instead, they found him where the trees began to thin, not deep inside, not lost, not dragged, just there, on his knees at first glance, like he had stopped mid-step, like he had been trying to stand again, but when they got closer, they saw the truth. He had fallen forward, hands still pressed into the dirt, fingers curled slightly as if they had tried to grip something that wasn't there anymore. His rifle lay a few feet away, unfired after the last shot, undisturbed, and his body was intact. No tearing, no visible damage, no blood. One of the men dropped to the ground beside him immediately, turning him carefully, checking for breathing, for pulse, for anything that suggested he was still alive or had gone down recently. There was nothing, no warmth, no resistance, and when they exposed his neck, they saw it, the mark, same as the animal's, but deeper, more precise, more intentional, placed exactly where it needed to be. The man pulled his hand back slowly, his face tightening as he looked up at the others, because there was no confusion left now, no denial, no room for explanation that fit within anything they understood. It took him the same way, he said quietly. No one argued, because it was obvious, too obvious. But there was something else, something worse. They checked the ground around him, expecting disturbance, expecting signs of struggle, expecting anything that showed he had fought, moved, resisted. There was nothing. No dragged earth, no broken branches, no scattered debris, only the impressions Carter had followed the night before, and one more, closer to where he had fallen, deeper, heavier, and directly aligned with his position. One of the men followed that impression with his eyes, tracing it forward, looking for where it led, where it ended, where it might reveal direction or movement. It didn't. It simply stopped, like whatever had made it had been there and then wasn't. They stood in silence for a moment, not long, but long enough for the weight of what they were looking at to settle in completely. This wasn't livestock anymore. This wasn't something that stayed at the edges. This wasn't a threat that could be avoided by closing fences or staying indoors. This had stepped into the same space as them and taken one of their own the same way it had taken everything else. One of the men moved toward the nearby brush, scanning low, checking for anything else that might have been left behind, anything that could explain how it moved, how it approached, how it left without trace. And that's when he saw it, lying just beyond Carter's reach, a piece of wood, not dropped, not caught, placed deliberately, different from the others, shorter, heavier. The marks along it deeper than any they had ever seen before, worn into the surface in a way that showed repeated use, consistent pressure, refinement. At one end, it tapered, not roughly, not naturally, but shaped, designed. The man picked it up slowly, turning it in his hand, feeling the weight, the balance, the way it narrowed toward the tip. This one's not new, he said. The others looked over. He held it out slightly. This one's been used a lot. No one needed more explanation than that, because now they understood the pattern fully. It didn't just use these tools, it improved them. It kept the ones that worked, it replaced the ones that didn't. And when it found something better, it used it again and again and again, until it became exact. One of the men looked back at Carter's body, then at the wood, then at the ground where the last impression had been made. And he said something none of them wanted to hear, but none of them could deny anymore. It wasn't hunting last night. The others waited. It was testing. Silence followed because that meant Carter hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been chosen. A controlled encounter, a measured response, a way to confirm something, to refine something. And now, whatever had learned from that would come back better. The wind finally moved through the trees just slightly, just enough to break the stillness that held since they arrived. But it didn't bring relief because now they weren't dealing with something unknown. They were dealing with something that had proven it could do the same thing to them as easily as it had done to everything else. And it had left behind proof that it was getting more precise every time. By the time they buried Carter, nobody spoke about sleep anymore because sleep implied distance from what was happening, and there was no distance left. Not in the land, not in the fences, not in the silence that had started to feel like it belonged to something else entirely. The men didn't leave the area. They couldn't. Instead, they began doing something worse than watching. They began documenting. Every ranch that reported an incident was visited. Every fence line was checked. Every missing animal was counted. And every piece of wood was collected. At first, they thought it was random, different sizes, different wear, different cuts. But once they laid them out together across the floor of the old storage barn, something started to form that none of them were prepared to recognize. Not a pile, not evidence, a pattern, a structure. The pieces weren't scattered randomly, they were organized by something they hadn't done themselves. Larger pieces grouped near the center, smaller ones forming outer lines, heavier, worn pieces clustered toward one side, newer ones toward the other. One of the men stepped back slowly, shaking his head. "No," he muttered, "we didn't do that." Another man looked at him sharply. Then what did? No answer came because none of them had moved the pieces like that. They had just dropped them where they were found, and yet the arrangement was deliberate, as if something had already decided what they meant. One of the older ranchers crouched slowly, studying the center of the formation more closely, his hand hovering just above the wood but not touching it. "This isn't a pile," he said quietly. "It's a record." The word landed heavier than expected. A record meant intention. It meant memory. It meant repetition. And repetition meant time. Another man leaned in, eyes narrowing. "You're saying it keeps track of them?" The older man didn't answer immediately, but he wasn't sure if "it" was the right word anymore. Not after Carter, not after what they had seen in the field, not after the way the animals were marked with precision instead of violence. Finally he spoke. "I'm saying it knows where it's been." The barn went quiet. Outside, the wind pressed against the wooden walls, making them creak softly, but inside, nothing moved. Because now they were looking at something that suggested history. Not random attacks, not isolated incidents, but continuity. One of the younger men pointed toward a cluster of the newest pieces. "These ones are all from this week," he said. Then he pointed to another cluster. "These are older, different wear, different cuts." He paused. "And these," he added, pointing toward the deepest worn group, "these look like they've been used for a long time." The realization spread slowly, uncomfortably, because it meant what they were seeing wasn't just escalation. It was timeline. One man stood up abruptly, pacing once across the barn floor. "So it starts somewhere," he said, "moves through farms, leaves tools behind, improves them, and keeps going." No one corrected him, because that was the only explanation that fit. Another man shook his head slightly. "But where does it end?" he asked. No one answered that either, because looking at the arrangement again, they realized something else. The layout wasn't just organized, it was directional. The oldest, most worn pieces were all positioned toward one side of the barn, toward the exit, toward the road, toward everything beyond the farms, and the newest were facing inward, like something had recently turned its attention back toward them. One of the men stepped closer, voice lowering. "Are you saying it's moving outward?" The older rancher didn't move his eyes from the wood. "No," he said slowly. A pause. Then it already did. Silence dropped instantly, heavy, final, because that meant everything they had seen, the animals, Carter, the fence lines, the sightings, wasn't a wave passing through. It wasn't a passing predator. It was already established, already spread, already present in more places than they had realized. One of the men finally spoke again, quieter this time. "Then why are we still seeing it here?" No one answered at first, until the older rancher looked down at the newest cluster of wood pieces, the ones that were still fresh, still sharp, still recently used, and he said the thing none of them wanted to accept, because it didn't leave. A long silence followed, then another man whispered, almost to himself, "It just learned faster here." And that's when the barn suddenly felt too small, not physically, but in the way everything inside it now felt like it had been placed inside something larger, something that had already been watching them arrange it all. The first place they noticed, it wasn't a new ranch. It was the first one, the original site, the one everyone assumed had been cleared after the initial incident. Two men went back just to confirm something simple: fence integrity, animal count, signs of any new movement. They didn't expect anything else, but when they arrived just after dawn, the field looked wrong in a way that took a few seconds to register, not because something had changed dramatically, but because something had been replaced. The animals that had survived the first incident were gone, not scattered, not injured, gone. The pens were intact, the gates still closed, the wire still intact, but inside, nothing. One of the men stepped forward slowly, scanning the ground immediately for signs of forced entry, for gaps in the fencing, for anything that explained how livestock could disappear without breaking a single barrier. There were none, not even the smallest disturbance. Then he saw something near the far corner of the enclosure, a shape on the ground. Wood. He didn't call out immediately, he just stared at it, because it wasn't just one piece this time. It was multiple, laid carefully along the fence line. Not caught, not dropped, placed. The second man approached from behind him, noticing his stillness. "What is it?" he asked. The first man didn't answer right away. Then he bent down slowly and picked one up. This one was different, shorter than the others they had collected before, thicker at the base, the markings deeper and more uniform, like something had been gripping it repeatedly under controlled pressure rather than chaotic force. He turned it slowly in his hand, then looked along the fence again, and that's when he saw the spacing. The wood pieces weren't random, they were evenly distributed along the perimeter, one every few posts, like markers, like something had walked the entire boundary and left a point of reference at each section. The second man's voice lowered. "That wasn't there yesterday." The first man nodded slowly, because that was the problem. It meant something, someone had returned, not once, but deliberately, to this exact place.
He stood up and moved along the fence line, checking each post carefully. Every few steps, another piece. Same pattern, same placement logic, same consistent spacing. It wasn't vandalism, it wasn't leftover evidence. It was repetition. And repetition meant intent. By the time they reached the barn, both men had stopped speaking altogether. The barn door was slightly open, not broken, not forced, just open. A small gap, enough for air, enough for movement. One of them reached the door slowly, pushing it wider. Inside, everything was still intact. Empty stalls, undisturbed ground, no animals, no sound of struggle. But the center of the barn had changed. The wood pieces they had arranged days ago were still there, but now they were no longer organized the same way. The structure had shifted, not collapsed, not disturbed randomly, rearranged, cleanly, precisely. One of the men stepped back immediately. "No," he said quietly, "we didn't touch this." The other man moved closer, eyes scanning the formation. It had changed direction again. Now the oldest pieces were no longer facing outward. They were facing inward, toward the center of the barn, and the newest pieces were gone, completely. The first man's voice dropped. "They were here yesterday." The second man nodded slowly. "So someone came back." A pause. Then, or it did. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before it, because this time there was no debate, no interpretation, no room for alternative explanation. Someone had entered a sealed space, a space they had controlled, a space they had watched, and it had done what it always did. It had changed the arrangement. One of them stepped forward cautiously, inspecting the center of the formation more closely, and that's when he noticed something new. A mark pressed into the dirt beneath the wood, not a footprint, not a track, but a depression, circular in shape, deep enough to suggest weight, sustained weight, like something had paused there for a long time. The second man stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper now. "How long do you think it stayed?" The first man didn't answer because he was looking at something else. Just beyond the formation, near the barn wall, another piece of wood, new, fresh, still light in color compared to the others and positioned differently than all the rest. Not part of the arrangement, not part of the record, separate, deliberate, like it had been placed there after everything else had already been changed. The second man noticed it too. He swallowed hard. That one wasn't there when we left. No one moved for a moment, because that meant something simple, something final. They hadn't been documenting it. They hadn't been tracking it. They hadn't been leaving it space to return. They stopped sleeping after that. Not officially, but nobody really went home anymore. The farms were too connected now, not by distance, but by pattern. The pattern was tightening in a way that made every location feel like part of a single enclosed system, rather than separate incidents happening in scattered places. On the seventh night after Carter's death, it happened everywhere at once. Not attacks, not silence, not sightings, but silence. Every ranch they had been monitoring went quiet at the same time, like something had flipped a switch across multiple locations without needing to travel between them in a way anyone could detect. One of the men checked the radio first, static. Another checked the old phone line system between properties, dead. No signals, no calls, no updates, just absence. That's when they started moving again, not toward one location, but all of them, splitting into groups, covering ground they had already covered before, but this time faster, because something about the silence felt timed, coordinated, intentional. The first ranch they reached looked normal from a distance, too normal, lights off, barn closed, fence intact, but no animals, no movement, no sound. They approached carefully, weapons ready, not because they expected a fight, but because not expecting anything had already proven to be the wrong assumption too many times. One of the men pushed the gate open. It swung without resistance, no lock, no obstruction, just one space. Inside, everything was empty, not disturbed, not destroyed. Empty. Even the ground looked different, smoothed in places, compressed in others, like something had moved through slowly enough to avoid chaos but deliberately enough to erase variation. One of the men knelt down immediately, running his hand across the soil. "It's been here," he said, not as a question, as confirmation. Another man moved toward the barn. The door was closed, but not locked. He pushed it open slowly and stopped immediately. Inside, there were no wood pieces, no formation, no arrangement, nothing, just bare ground, clean, stripped, like everything that had been there before had been removed intentionally. The second man stepped in beside him, scanning the empty space. "They took it all back," he said quietly. No one corrected him, because the phrasing didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the implication. If it had removed every trace, then it didn't need the record anymore, which meant the record had already been completed or transferred. One of the men looked back outside toward the fence line, and that's when he noticed something new. The posts, each one had a mark, small, identical, placed at the same height, the same depth, like something had touched each one in sequence, not randomly, not during movement, but deliberately. He stepped closer to one of the posts, running his finger over the indentation. It was fresh, very fresh. Another man followed his gaze, then another, and soon all of them were moving along the fence line, confirming what their instincts were already telling them. Every post, every section, every boundary, marked, not damaged, not broken, not altered, signed. One of the men finally spoke. "It came back here." Another shook his head slowly. "No." A pause. Then, "It never left." Silence followed that, because it had changed everything. If it hadn't left, then it hadn't been moving between places. It had been present in all of them, simultaneously, waiting, adjusting, expanding without travel. One of the younger men finally asked the question no one wanted to say out loud. "Then why now?" No one answered immediately until the oldest man looked at the barn again, at the empty space inside, at the erased formation, at the absence that felt more intentional than anything they had seen so far, and he said quietly, "Because it's done studying us." A long pause. Then it's starting something else. The wind moved through the fence again, but this time it didn't feel like air, it felt like timing. And somewhere in the distance, a barn door they couldn't see from their position slowly closed on its own. The next morning, they tried to establish boundaries, not physical ones. Those had already proven meaningless, but operational ones. Patrol routes, watch rotations, signal checks, anything that could create structure around what was clearly no longer random. But every structure they built collapsed the same way, quietly, without warning. A patrol team sent to the northern line never radioed back. A second group sent to check the eastern fence arrived to find their own vehicle parked exactly where they had left it, but no sign of the men who drove it. The engine was still warm, the doors were open, the keys were still in the ignition, as if they had stepped out and never decided to come back in. The remaining men regrouped at the central barn, the only place that still felt slightly controlled, even though none of them trusted that feeling anymore. No one spoke for several minutes, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything they could say sounded like it belonged to a situation that made sense, and this no longer did. Then one of them pointed at the ground, just outside the barn entrance. Another mark, fresh, pressed into the soil, deeper than before and wider, like something heavier had stood there this time. The oldest man didn't approach it immediately, he just stared at it, because now the pattern wasn't just repeating, it was changing scale. He finally crouched, studying it closely. This isn't one creature anymore, someone whispered behind him. He didn't correct them, because it didn't matter anymore what it was called. What mattered was consistency. And there was too much of it, across too many places, too many identical outcomes, too many empty spaces where something should have been left behind. One of the younger men suddenly spoke, voice tense. The farms aren't separate anymore. No one responded because that was already obvious, but he continued anyway. They're connected. That word made something shift in the group, not physically, mentally, because connected meant pathway, and pathway meant movement. But they had never seen movement, only results, only absence, only the aftermath. The oldest man stood slowly, looking out past the barn, past the fence line, toward the distant fields where the early light was just beginning to reveal the land again. And then he said something quieter than everything else so far. There was never more than one place. Everyone turned toward him. He didn't look back. Just one system. And we only noticed it when it started using us as markers. No one interrupted because the idea wasn't theoretical anymore. It was visible now. In the spacing of marks, in the timing of disappearances, in the way every location mirrored the others without ever exchanging anything physically. One of the men stepped forward slightly. "So what do we do?" he asked. The question hung in the air longer than it should have, because it implied there was still something to act on, still something to stop, still something to respond to. The oldest man finally turned back toward them, and for the first time he didn't look like he had an answer. He looked like he had reached the edge of explanation. "We stopped dividing it," he said slowly. A pause. "We treat it as one place." No one liked that answer because it removed the illusion of distance, and distance was the only thing that had been making any of this survivable. Then, from somewhere beyond the fence line, a sound, not loud, not sudden, just precise, like something had adjusted its position again. Every man froze instantly, not because they didn't know what it was, but because they did. And for the first time since this began, it wasn't arriving. It was already there, across all of them. No one ran when the sound came, not because they were brave, but because running no longer made sense in a place where distance had already stopped behaving like a rule. The sound had been small, controlled, almost polite, like something adjusting its position in a room it already owned. And in that instant, every man at the barn understood the same thing without speaking it. This wasn't an arrival, this was confirmation. The oldest man slowly lowered his weapon, not out of surrender, but because his grip had already started to feel irrelevant, like holding something meant for a situation that no longer existed in its original form. The wind moved again across the fence line, but this time it didn't pass through. It felt accounted for, measured, as if even the air had already been observed before. Then the marks appeared, not new ones, not additional ones. The existing marks along the fence posts, those identical, precise indentations, began to feel different as the men looked at them again. Not changes in shape, but awareness, like they were no longer just evidence left behind, they were reference points. One of the younger men whispered, barely audible, "They're not tracking us." No one responded. He swallowed hard and continued anyway. They already knew where everything is. A long silence followed. Then from somewhere deeper in the field, past the barn, past the lines they had been guarding, past the places they still believed were outside, a goat bleated once, sharp, sudden, then stopped immediately, not fading, not struggling, just ending. Every man turned toward the sound at the same time, but there was nothing visible there, only the field and the sense that something had already crossed it without needing to be seen. The oldest man finally spoke again, voice low. "It never moved farm to farm," he said. "It only ever moved attention." That sentence changed the room more than anything before it, because it explained everything they had tried to separate. Every ranch, every disappearance, every incident. They weren't locations, they were moments, observations, points in a system that didn't travel. It shifted focus. Another sound came, closer this time, not from the field, from inside the barn. One of the men stepped backward instinctively, but no one followed him, because nobody could decide anymore whether movement made them safer or simply more noticeable. The barn door creaked slightly, just once. No wind strong enough to explain it, no physical force visible, just the suggestion that something had acknowledged the structure from the inside. Then, a piece of wood slid across the ground near the entrance, not thrown, not dropped, placed, perfectly aligned with the threshold, the same material, the same marks, but this one was longer than any before it. Heavier looking, older. One of the men didn't speak this time. He just stared at it until his voice finally broke through anyway. "That's not new," he said. The oldest man nodded slowly. "No." A pause. "It's final." No one asked what that meant because they already understood. Every piece before it had been part of a record, part of learning, part of building. But this wasn't placement. It was conclusion. From beyond the fence line, the field shifted slightly, just enough to suggest movement without revealing source or shape, like something had decided the viewing angle no longer required concealment through distance. And then, for the first time, the men understood why they never saw it clearly, because it had never been hiding. It had simply never needed to be fully visible at all, at once. The oldest man lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, in recognition. "We weren't dealing with something that hurt, that hunts," he said quietly. "We were dealing with something that organizes." The barn stayed silent, the field stayed silent, and for the first time since it all began, nothing new happened, because nothing new was needed anymore.